simple question. Do you care that the Prime Minister of Australia has just dropped $4.3 million on a house? So this revelation came earlier this week that the sitting Prime Minister, who of course, dare say, wants to keep being the Prime Minister after the federal election that'll most likely land in May next year, TBD, has bought a home that he hopes to live in with his future wife, Jodie, once he stops being Prime Minister and, I dare say, stops being an elected member of the House of Representatives. Here's Anthony Albanese, the Prime Minister, speaking about it.
As a Prime Minister, I earn a good income. Now, I understand that I've been fortunate, but I also know what it's like to struggle. My mum lived in the one public housing that she was born in for all of her 65 years.
Peter Dutton, the opposition leader, has had something to say.
Well, it's a matter for the Prime Minister, but I wish he and Jodie well, and they're obviously planning for the next stage of life post-politics, and I wish them well in that. The Prime Minister can answer questions in relation to it otherwise, but the homeowners in Australia that I'm worried about at the moment are people who can't afford their mortgages. People have had 12 interest rate increases under this government.
David Littleproud, of course, is the leader of the Nationals. He's also been asked about it. Everyone's getting asked about it.
Oh, look, that's a totally personal decision for the Prime Minister, and I think we should respect that. He's a human being. We all are in politics. He's got every right to set himself up and his family up for whatever they do in the future, and I don't think we should begrudge any Australian that, no matter their position.
So, what do you reckon? It's kind of interesting. Journos keep asking politicians about it. There's some, opinionated column writers and such that are trying to suggest that maybe this is tone deaf for a Prime Minister to spend $4.3 million on a property in a cost of living crisis when housing affordability is at its lowest rate. But as you're hearing some of those pollies say, well, maybe they've done well for themselves and maybe that's a good thing in Australia. So, is this a sort of hidden question about class in Australia and how we view someone who's doing well for themselves? Should we begrudge it or should we celebrate it? Stephen Threadgold is a sociologist and director of the Newcastle Youth Studies Centre at the University of Newcastle. Stephen, good to talk to you this afternoon.
Hi, Paul. Thanks for having me on.
A bit of argy-bargy going on around the Prime Minister's house purchase. What do you make of it?
Oh, well, it's I suppose, one of those things in Australia at the moment that everyone's talking about for the last couple of years. Housing affordability is out of control. It's very hard for any young people to get into the housing market these days, particularly in any places where there's actually work for them. And so it's not surprising when, PM spends $4.5 million on a house, a second house, by the way, not the first house, that it causes a bit of consternation. I found it funny, the likes of Littleproud and Dutton's response, they were pretty muted. They weren't really criticising him too much, and that's because they've all got investment properties themselves, right? So it's, it's an interesting thing because it does seem a little bit tone deaf to splash out like this at a time, but this is what rich people do.
So this is the interesting thing, is that we have 226 odd MPs in our federal parliament across the House and Senate. They're all on a pretty good wicket because obviously, even if you're a backbencher, you're on, it's about roughly 200,000 a year. I haven't checked the latest stats. The Prime Minister's on roughly 600 a year. That's a good amount of money, right? So you've got a bit of buying power there. But on top of that, generally a lot of MPs enter Parliament already pretty well off, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the class makeup of our politicians is pretty mixed compared to a lot of other countries. We do have people in Parliament that are fairly working class. But I'd say for the most part, they enter a fairly straightforward trajectory. They often work for political parties for a long time. They're in the Young Labor or Young Liberals and all that kind of stuff. They tend to have fairly privileged backgrounds, private schools, work in the same networks of other privileged people. For a while there, we had a really high percentage of lawyers in the Parliament. That's a little bit less these days. But, yeah, our politicians do tend to be pretty well off. I suppose more importantly, though, in terms of the topic we're talking about, is that our politicians, particularly our federal ones, are a bunch of landlords, right? So, the figures there are pretty telling in terms of their own property. I think it's something like nearly 85% of politicians own a property and only 65% of Australians do. But I suppose it's more telling when it comes to investment properties and I think it's something like nearly 45% of our federal MPs have multiple properties. When it's only, I think, something like 15% of the general population. So we're represented in Parliament by landlords, and you would think, logically speaking, it's unlikely that those people are going to do much to, affect their own capital position, shall we say. So it's a really entrenched problem. They tend to represent people, they are owners of capital themselves, so they're not going to be doing too much to kind of alleviate the problem, I wouldn't have thought.
Stephen Threadgold is your guest this afternoon, sociologist and director of the Newcastle Youth Studies Centre at the University of Newcastle. Have you got a thought about this? Do you care that the Prime Minister's spent $4.3 million on a house on the Central Coast? 0487 99 12 33. The Prime Minister making the point that Jody, his soon-to-be wife, is a coastie, and so they wanted to buy a property where the family certainly resides, the larger family. Todd from Barna says, hi, Paul. Was it a problem for Malcolm Turnbull to have a beautiful country property? 0487 99 12 33 if you want to have your say. Matt from Lake Macquarie is also had his say, or in fact, I'll get to that text message in a bit. We've got Wayne at Colburn, 227 MPs and senators, 215 with investment properties. That's why it's hard to find a politician that's going to object. Well, there you go, Stephen. Wayne certainly echoing your sentiment there.
That's right. I think the stats I was talking about are a few years old. It sounds like it's only got worse. I mean, the other thing that annoys me a little bit about Albanese's response is he's constantly invoking his mother that lived in public housing as some kind of way that he means that he understands what's going on. I mean, and this is also a Prime Minister over the years that refuses to do anything about the level of welfare and kept our kind of welfare rate, well below the poverty line. And back when his mother was kind of accessing those kind of things, they were much more generous. It's kind of, I think, rather, distasteful in a way that he keeps kind of bringing that up as some kind of understanding of battlers' points of view while, very much acting like a rich person, right?
Matt from Lake Macquarie, perhaps echoing some of that sentiment, well, certainly in terms of talking about his background. Matt from Lake Macquarie saying, I think it's fantastic that a person who grew up with a single parent in housing commission is able to get to the top job in the country and afford a $4 million house, regardless of what his policies are or who you vote for. What an amazing country we live in. I feel this is a bit of tall poppy syndrome. So this really goes to really what I wanted to ask you about, Stephen, as well, which is, that nature of aspiration. We talk about him, referring to his housing commission days and how that plays into the politics of it. But also, what does that say about the fact that we have people that can, I suppose, by the, a phrase that's often used in the US of A, you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
Yeah, we in public kind of discussions about, how you get by in life, we tend to have this individualised understanding that, if you're talented enough and you work hard enough, the kind of idea of a meritocracy that people can move up the class system and do quite well. And, there's definitely examples of that. Our Prime Minister, arguably being one. But really, the social research across demographics show that those cases are very, very rare. People from disadvantaged backgrounds tend to remain disadvantaged throughout their lives, regardless of the choices they make, regardless of how much they work. The class system is very much entrenched in that sense. Over the past couple of decades, for instance, we've had widening participation in higher education. That's kind of alleviated some aspects of it a little bit in terms of evening things up. But overall, we largely end up in the same demographics that we're born into.
And do you have a view on when it comes to, I suppose, the Australian voters and the thinking about how well off and wealthy or successful our politicians are, and whether it's sort of, is it almost, distasteful to, well, maybe not, flaunt your wealth, but even to talk about it or to celebrate your own success?
Yeah, in Australia, I think we have a much more kind of tall poppy thing that's been part of our culture for a long time, and we're not really a culture that celebrates wealth as much as, say, the US, with kind of, bling and all that kind of stuff, But, I think we tend to try and be a little bit more modest and less kind of showy about our wealth in Australia compared to, the US example, for instance. But I think also in pop culture that's changing a little bit as well as, reality TV around, the kind of housewives of various rich suburbs and all that kind of stuff becomes more the norm. Those kind of things, I think, are having a bit of effect about what Australians think of wealth. But I think for the most part, we still maintain that kind of idea that you shouldn't flaunt your wealth that much, with, various examples where maybe that's not the case so much. But I don't know. I don't know. I don't really know how something like this plays out with voters. They tend to kind of. It's very hard to kind of know what issues, make people vote for one politician over another, and there's all kinds of polls and that kind of stuff. It tends to be about a general vibe, I think, more than anything. And I don't think this is very helpful for, someone that's meant to be of the left at the moment. It kind of, I think for people, particularly of the Labor base, probably don't like this too much, But I suppose on the other hand, it might appeal to kind of more right-wing voters, that do tend to kind of see wealth as more of a marker of success and worried less about inequality.
Although you have just pitched, I think accidentally, a fantastic new extension of The Real Housewives, which is The Real Housewives of Copacabana.
I think we'd all tune into that, for sure.
Stephen Threadgold, great to talk to you this afternoon.
Excellent, thank you. Bye-bye.
Stephen Threadgold, sociologist and director of the Newcastle Youth Studies Centre at the University of Newcastle. Yes, Copacabana is the suburb in which the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, has bought this home. Text message here.